My brother and mother changed the locks while I was at the hospital. They did it in the middle of a Tuesday shift. They called a special board meeting, voted me off the management team, and the next thing I knew, my swipe card didn't work and the office door had a new dead bolt. They handed me a letter that said, legally, I was no longer an officer of the company I had helped build with my hands. Yet they still expected me to run the production line's overnight shift because production can't stop. It hurt because I had poured years into that building, because my name was on invoices, because I had slept in the warehouse office during recalls, and because the same people who voted me out were the same people who had signed checks out of the drawer I kept my mortgage payments in. I'm Caroline. I was the operations director and a 30% shareholder at Ellis and Ridge Foods, a family-run co-packer in northeastern Pennsylvania. The firm made pickled vegetables and small batch condiments for regional grocery chains. It was never about millions. It was steady revenue, 3 to 5% margins depending on the raw cucumber crop, and enough to keep 3 families in the neighborhood going. My brother Mark sat as CEO. My mother Linda was on the board and handled HR and payroll for 20 years. Together they had pushed me off the executive ladder with a 2-sentence motion and the signatures of hand-picked employees who had been told to vote for continuity. They told me continuity would be easier without what they called my day-to-day interference. What it meant in practice was I was being stripped of operational control while still contractually tied to much of the company's outside obligations. I hadn't been able to simply walk away. I had personally guaranteed a $150,000 small business line of credit at Fulton Savings to secure the inventory purchases in our seasonal cycle. My house, an old, neat place with a sagging porch, had been collateral on 2 loans we took out when we expanded the freezing rooms in 2016. I had 3 salaried employees who reported to me directly. If the company failed to pay suppliers, they would be out of work too. The pantry shelves at home were full of jars stamped with our label. I had a stake that felt less financial and more like an extended, fragile domestic life. At the outset, they made a show of being practical. Caroline, Mark said over coffee in the break room, that same bland managerial voice he'd learned from consultants. You can still supply the ingredients, but operationally, it's time for a different direction. Linda, with her knees too close together, told me the board felt I was distracted. There were the usual phrases: better alignment, strategic refocus. All of them left unspoken the personal historiography, my late father's workbench where we'd once soldered a jar sealing machine, Mark's increasing contempt for my caution about accounting entries, and my everyday resentments that had accumulated like grime in a drain. The dependency was concrete. I had built a small supply company, Caroline Ellis Trading Company, when I was 28 to source and pre-process cucumbers from local farmers. It started as work for hire. We would pick, wash, slice, and deliver to Ellis and Ridge on tight timelines that only my crew and I could meet. Over the years, my trading company became what the business relied on: seasonal rushes, sudden crop failures at other suppliers, last-minute contract add-ons. My company had the cold chain, the routes, the relationships. I had the trucks and the filed certificates of analysis where my name appeared as responsible for food safety. My company was legally separate, but functionally entwined with the family business. I wanted them to succeed. I also wanted to be treated like a partner. At first, the exclusion was almost theatrical, small and public. I would pass the main office and the receptionist would redirect me to the back door. My badge worked for the production floor, but not for the boardroom. There were moments that felt petty and sharp. Mark moved my personal toolbox into a storage closet and hung a sign that said company property. My email account to the company server was deactivated for what HR called security reasons. The CFO, a man who had once taken my side on weekend inventory counts, started copying my invoices to a group email that excluded me and then marking them received without my shipment manifest attached. The first escalation loop was about money. The CFO, Blake, he came down to the loading bay and told me there would be a delay in payment for 3 of my invoices, $42,300 total, because they were short on cash that quarter. He offered partial payment as a bridge. I remember the exact amount and the acrid taste of bile when he said it. $12,000 now, the rest after reconciliation. My reaction was practical and immediate. I called my line of credit and asked them to release funds. They said they needed waiting days. The draw took time and fees. I set up an emergency payroll out of my personal account to cover my 2 drivers who were owed a week's wages. The consequence was immediate. My own bank balance dipped into an uncomfortable red. I ate cereal for dinner for a month while I balanced invoices, and invoices crossed with demands. The situation worsened because when I raised the issue at a stakeholder lunch, an attempt to keep things civil, Mark said aloud that I was overreacting in front of a supplier who had been considering a long-term contract. Gossip spread, and a distributor started to hint about stability concerns in the company. My leverage weakened. My credibility with outsiders was subtly eroded. Then the exclusion got procedural. The board revised the procurement policy. They cut down my authority to approve purchase orders. From a practical standpoint, every wagon I had signed out for the last 7 years suddenly needed a sign-off from the procurement committee that excluded me. When a freezer valve failed at 2 a.m, the maintenance crew, who used to call me at odd hours, was instructed to call Mark instead. The immediate result was a 48-hour downtime that cost us a small contract with a co-packer in Brooklyn. The consequence was both reputational and financial. My reaction was private and cold. I stayed up for 3 nights scanning through old purchase orders and cross-checking serial numbers. I catalogued everything the way an accountant catalogues debts. The situation worsened because the board then began to audit orders that had my initial sign-off, prompting an HR investigation into irregular practices that had no concrete accusations, but plenty of insinuation. Humiliation followed the procedural power plays. At the annual production party, the one our staff called the 4th of July, Mark made a short speech about stability. He thanked everyone for their loyalty, excluding me by name. People clapped. The woman who had once been my assistant came up to me after the party with a hand over her mouth and confessed she had been told if she spoke to me about company matters, she would be disciplined. This was the first time an intimate friend at work chose the board over me openly. My reaction was a hollow, slow burn. I didn't raise my voice. I packed my coat and left earlier than I'd intended, and in the parking lot, I sat in my car and held the steering wheel with both hands until the night air stopped making the lights puddle. The consequence was the erosion of my social support at work. The situation worsened when 2 more employees were let go for restructuring, both of whom had been on my crew. Manipulation was the steady drumbeat. Linda would call me and speak as if nothing had changed. "We're family." "Oh, Caro." And then she would pivot into practicalities that were in fact threats. She insisted I continue taking certain shipments because that would keep the lines moving. When I hesitated, she reminded me gently that I had guaranteed certain loans for the family's good. It was a rhetorical device that wrapped obligation into affection. My reaction was to keep records of each call, timestamps, and notes, because I didn't trust my memory to be the only evidentiary trail. The consequence was a dread that lodged itself under my sternum. The situation worsened when they withheld benefits paperwork related to my health insurance during a month in which I had 2 doctor visits. It felt less like an administrative oversight and more like a pressure tactic wrapped in bureaucracy. I tried legal steps. I hired a lawyer and asked about emergency relief, the kind that would force them to honor invoices or reverse the board action. He was good and cautious. His first question was the one I dreaded. Could I afford protracted litigation? The answer was no. He reminded me delays would cost me freight charges and storage fees, and possibly the staff I still had. I walked out of the firm with a stack of photocopies of corporate minutes and a legal letter to the board that was measured and cold. The board responded with a lawyer that was also sharp, and the letters became thicker, with formal language and threats of countersuits for alleged breaches of fiduciary duty. Each letter cost us something: money for the company and the emotional bandwidth to manage an argument that felt intimate and petty. My reaction was to tighten my focus on the one thing no one could take away without my cooperation: the logistics and supply lines under Caroline Ellis Trading Company. The consequence of that focus was that I started to physically sleep in my dispatch office again, checking invoices at 2 a.m. because supply chains don't negotiate their own timelines. The story looped like that: betrayal, reaction, consequence, deterioration, until the low point. The day I lost leverage entirely was a Tuesday in late October, when a sheriff's deputy came to the warehouse with a court order to seize 2 refrigerated trucks and a pallet of jars stored under my company's name. They were there because of a lien claim filed by a small ingredient supplier I'd used in August. They said Ellis and Ridge had not paid, and as guarantor of invoices, my company was responsible. The deputy read the list of assets aloud, while Mark and Blake stood off to one side with file folders. I stood near the pallet and watched the men lift the truck's keys out of my dispatch ledger and hand them to the deputy. Those trucks were the backbone of my routes. Losing them overnight meant missing delivery windows that would cost us contract penalties, and the trust of a dozen grocery managers who scheduled us months in advance. It felt like a private abandonment. My mother, who had always been good with a casserole and being inside the kitchen's gravity, said she couldn't interfere because this is a business issue. Mark looked at me as if business issues were a different species of pain. My employees stood and watched while strangers took equipment we had used to keep food safe. In that moment, I felt not only financially threatened, but morally stripped, like someone had taken the keys to my history. I sat on an overturned crate in a freezing bay, the fluorescent lights buzzing, and let myself be cold. I had lost leverage. I had lost transport. I had bills. I had a washer of humiliation. I felt trapped and abandoned. Every covenant I had honoured now felt like a chain. After the deputies left, a quiet, heavy thing happened. The maintenance manager, a man named Joe, who had been with us since before I could tell a drive shaft from a conveyor belt, put his hand on my shoulder and said, softly, "We need you, Caro, we really do." He wasn't asking for permission, he was stating a fact. I heard it the way people sometimes hear a weather forecast. Inevitable, unchangeable. My leverage had narrowed to a single small thing: knowledge. I knew the pickling timelines. I knew where to source a certain grade of brine at a drop shipment rate. I had preserved test reports and supplier contact lists in my laptop and in emails. I had the kind of institutional memory that small companies run on and that no board resolution could simply erase. The turning point came 3 days later, but it wasn't dramatic. It was a mistake, a simple human error that revealed their dependence. But Blake, the CFO, had been prepping numbers for our major buyer, a regional chain called Harrow & Sons. He meant to send a consolidated vendor list to their purchasing department to reassure them about supply continuity. He attached, by mistake, the working spreadsheet that listed vendors in the format we had always used: supplier name, VAT number, a tax ID, bank details, ongoing credit terms, and the internal notes about seasonal capacity. In that spreadsheet, 3 columns detailed the volume commitments for the calendar year and included an internal note typed in a cell at 3:12 a.m. during a long night that said, "Primary Fresh Supply, Caroline Ellis Trading Company, high reliability, buffer stock maintained, CC, Ops." Blake forwarded the spreadsheet to Harrow & Sons and to an internal email group that included the board, the COO, and an external auditor. He also accidentally CC'd me. At first, I thought it was an invitation. I opened the spreadsheet and read the cell in a daze. The spreadsheet made explicit what everyone had been pretending to avoid. For certain SKUs, notably our seasonal garlic dill, Ellis & Ridge was functionally dependent on my company. They had structured contracts predicated on my ability to supply. They had not transferred those supply obligations or purchased alternative vendors with the capacity to match our turnaround times. The spreadsheet was a kind of confession rendered in cells and formulas. No melodrama, just a neat column that put the dependency in black and white. My reaction was not celebratory. I felt a strange and immediate fatigue, an intake of professional breath, and a recalibration of options. I printed the spreadsheet. I sat at my kitchen table under the kitchen lamp and read it 3 times. The nodes of leverage became visible. Unpaid invoices I could call due, the lien on inventory that could be enforced, the lost trucks, and the clear, unarguable fact that if Harrow & Sons lost supply continuity, Ellis & Ridge faced penalties running into tens of thousands of dollars. They needed me every harvest cycle, more than they had acknowledged. The mistake gave me a plain path to negotiation, not revenge. I composed a 1-page letter that night. It was not a threat dressed as a legal brief. It was a business letter. I itemized the outstanding invoices, the overnight transport credits I required to restore route integrity, and the payment schedule. I added a practical line: "We cannot resume supply until vehicles are released or until alternative transport is arranged in writing." I sent it to Mark, to Blake, to Linda, to the board, and to Harrow and Sons purchasing manager with a polite note asking for confirmation of receipt and suggested a conference call. I didn't gloat. I didn't demand ownership of the company. And I made clear what I needed to do my job. I did, however, send a copy to the lawyer with instructions. If payment wasn't forthcoming within 7 days, we would attach the unpaid invoices to a UCC filing that would act as a security interest. It was the quietest possible escalation, a procedural, market-oriented assertion of control. There was a flurry of activity after my letter. Mark called me first and spoke in short sentences. He apologized. An awkward technical apology that sounded like it had been run through a PR team. Blake claimed accounting errors and promised immediate review. Linda left a voicemail that was half sugar, half thunder about family and pragmatic steps. But Harrow and Sons called first. Their purchasing manager, Rosa, whose voice had a North Philadelphia directness, said simply, "We got your note. Are you able to fulfill the expected delivery next week?" I told Rosa that I could fulfill it if we had either the trucks back or a written third-party arrangement for transport and immediate payment for the outstanding invoices. She told me to invoice Harrow and Sons directly for the volume they had scheduled with Ellis and Ridge, pending their internal settlement, an unusual step, and to bill them with Caroline Ellis Trading Company as the supplier. She wanted to preserve shelf displays and continuity more than corporate family drama. That move changed the leverage. Suddenly, the company I had been kicked out of faced a potential interruption to a major buyer if they didn't settle accounts. The market and their customers cared more about the jars on the shelf than about my familial ostracism. The board, which had seemed immovable, became reactive. The trucks were released from the lien when someone, Mark or the board, wired enough to the lien holder to secure the asset temporarily. We turned the shipment and kept Harrow and Sons supplied that week. I spent the next 48 hours coordinating drivers, cross-checking cooler temperatures, and negotiating a short-term carrier rate to bridge the gap for the trucks we still didn't have fully cleared in the name of my company. The consequence was not that I was restored to the board or that any family accord dawned suddenly. They still kept the office deadbolt. They still had their votes and their narrative. The payoff was quieter and more realistic. We reached a written supplier agreement where my company would supply specified SKUs for a defined period on firm payment terms, and they agreed to a payment schedule for the outstanding invoices. I did not take back the title. What I took concretely was a cash flow, $58,700 over 30 days that paid down the line of credit and allowed me to regain 3 drivers. I secured a contract clause that required 30-day payment terms with penalties for late payment, simple contractual protection. I also secured an operational clause that required that no board action result in the unilateral blocking of operational access to the supply chain without either notice or a temporary escrow arrangement. In other words, I created a safety valve. Emotionally, the consequences were mixed. It was not triumph. It was a practical recalibration of power. I found myself sitting in the back of the warehouse after that first week, watching the forks slide pallets into place and feeling a slow, complicated relief. I was being paid. I had preserved jobs. I had not been invited back into the kitchen table conversations at home. There were quiet resentments that lingered in the staff that I had once been able to call friends. There were still days when Mark's voice had that clipped steeliness and Linda would drop a line about family first that made my jaw tighten. But the more consequential thing was how it changed my posture. Where I had once been all in on being family as an organizing value, someone who deferred professional claims for the sake of domestic continuity, I learned to separate the personal ledger from the commercial ledger. That didn't mean I stopped feeling betrayal. I catalogued it like an account of damages, but I didn't let it define my ability to act. I made contracts that had teeth. I let the market adjudicate some part of the argument, and the market's interest in consistent supply forced the board to confront a reality they had been dodging. You can't run a food business on familial sentiment alone. The long-term consequences were quieter still. I left the management building in practice, but I built an independent vendor business that was no longer under the same roof. Caroline Ellis Trading Company. It grew modestly into something with a couple of full-time office staff, an accountant who liked numbers, and a carrier arrangement that didn't rely on trucks we didn't own. I diversified my accounts slowly. One grocery chain in the Mid-Atlantic, 2 specialty food lines, and a restaurant group that needed small batch pickles. My revenue in the first year after the separation wasn't astronomical, but it was steady. And it came with an autonomy I hadn't known I craved. In the family, the relations shifted. Holidays were awkward for a long time. Linda and I had a conversation a year later where she said, haltingly, "We were protecting the company." I said nothing about the locks. I told her the truth about needing separation to do my work. Mark and I are in the same room sometimes. Conversation is practical. We exchange emails that are transactional and sometimes transport instructions. There are moments of tenderness from old memories and moments of impatience. There are also days when the absence of shared office life means there is no daily friction, and that is its own relief. There is a small private satisfaction I carry when I walk into a grocery store and see a shelf of jars that had my crew in the name on the label. I feel steadier than I did in the months of being locked out. I know now how to build a firm that respects my skills and my labor without asking me to exchange my sense of personhood as collateral. The quiet payoff is not dramatic. I don't own the company. I don't have a flashing headline announcing vindication. What I have is control over my work, a legal agreement that prevents the kind of ad hoc seizure we experienced, and the ability to sleep nights without inventory, worries circling like a vulture. At the end, I want to make clear that I did not intend malice. I did not build a plan to punish my family. I just refused to be defenseless. The thing about family businesses is they often start with love and end with entitlement. People conflate kindness with ownership and, over time, assume that affection covers up bad accounting. When that assumption breaks, it hurts. It will continue to hurt in ways I can't always anticipate. At a Christmas time table, in a voicemail, in the way my niece looks at me when my name comes up and then looks away. But it also taught me to keep a few things close and contractual. So the next time someone thinks a lock can resolve a dispute, the market will have already written an answer in our payment terms. If you're still with me, thank you for listening to the long, messy arc of this. If you're thinking about your own family entanglements and business, that's a very human place to be. You don't have to like how it looks for me. If you want to hear more stories like this, slowly told, not flashy, leave a like. If you want to follow along with what happens next, subscribe. Did anything like this ever happen in your family or workplace? I'd be interested to read about it in the comments.